And so he created these characters, and often they spoke in the first person. And the two one-person plays that I'm doing are derived by Dickens from these stories for his own public readings. And they were among the most popular of his shows in those phenomenally successful public readings that he did in the last 10 years of his life. And the one called Dr. Marigold was second only in popularity to A Christmas Carol. And it's not been seen for 150 years. Nobody's performed it, and it's a masterpiece. And Dr. Marigold is a massive and complex story. It's an hour and something long, but one of the funniest things he ever wrote, one of the most startling, because it deals right at the centre of it with the idea of deaf and dumb people and how one, how they integrate into society, and then infinitely touching and all done in the most dazzling patter, sales talk, really. Every single phase of the story is narrated by the travelling salesman, who is Dr. Marigold, in terms of buying and selling and exchanging and doing deals and all that. It's a virtuoso piece. It's fantastic to do. These stories, both of them in utterly different ways, are profoundly stirring in that way. You just long for us to have a Dickens who would be able to draw attention so strongly and clearly and unforgettably to the injustices in our society. I mean, he really does. He said somewhere that his intention was to produce in his readers and in his hearers the feeling, it must not be.
I am a cheapjack, and my own father's name was Willem Marigold. It was, in his lifetime, supposed by some that his name was William, but my own father always consistently said, no, it was Willem. On which point I content myself with looking at the argument this way. If a man is not allowed to know his own name in a free country, how much is he allowed to know in a land of slavery? As to looking at the argument through the medium of the register, Willem Marigold came into the world before registers come up much, and went out of it too. They wouldn't have been greatly in his line neither, if they had chanced to come up before him. I was born on the Queen's Highway, but it was the King's at that time. A doctor was fetched to my own mother by my own father when it took place on a common, and in consequence of his being a very kind gentleman, and accepting no fee but a tea-tray, I was named Doctor, out of gratitude and compliment to him. There you have me, Dr. Marigold. I am at present a middle-aged man of a broadish build, in cords, leggings, and a sleeved waistcoat, the strings of which is always gone behind. Repair them how you will, they go like fiddle-strings. You've been in the theatre, and you've seen one of the violin players screw up his violin after listening to it as if it had been whispering the secret to him that it feared it was out of order, and then you have heard it snap. That's as exactly similar to my waistcoat as a waistcoat and a violin can be like one another. I'm partial to a white hat, and I like a shawl round my neck, wore loose and easy. Sitting down is my favourite posture. If I have a taste in point of personal jewellery, it is mother-of-pearl buttons. There you have me again, as large as life. The doctor having accepted a tea-tray, you'll guess that my father was a cheap-jack before me. You're right, he was. It was a pretty tray. It represented a large lady going along a serpentining uphill gravel walk to attend a little church. Two swans had likewise come astray with the same intentions. When I call her a large lady, I don't mean in point of breadth, for there she fell below my views, but she more than made up it in length. Her height and slimness was, in short, the height of both. I often saw that tray, after I was the innocently smiling cause, or more like screeching cause, of the doctor's standing it up on a table against the wall in his consulting room. Whenever my own father and mother were in that part of the country, I used to put my head— I've heard my own mother say it was flaxen curls at that time, though you wouldn't know an old hearth broom from it now, till you came to the handle and found it wasn't me— in at the doctor's door, and the doctor was always glad to see me and said, "Aha, my brother practitioner! Come in, little MD. How are your inclinations as to sixpence?" You can't go on forever, you'll find, nor yet could my father, nor yet my mother. If you don't go off as a whole, when you are about due, you are liable to go off in part. And 2 to 1, your head's the part. Gradually my father went off his, and my mother went off hers. It was in a harmless way, but it put out the family where I boarded them. The old couple, though retired, got to be wholly and solely devoted to the cheapjack business, and were always selling the family off. Whenever the cloth was laid for dinner, my father began rattling the plates and dishes, as we do in our line when we put up crockery for a bid, only he'd lost the trick of it and mostly let 'em drop and broke 'em. As the old lady had been used to sit in the cart and hand the articles out one by one to the old gentleman on the footboard to sell, just in the same way she handed him every item of the family's property, and they disposed of it in their own imaginations from morning to night. At last the old gentleman, lying bedridden in the same room with the old lady, cries out in the old patter, fluent after having been silent for 2 days and nights, "Now hear, my jolly companions every one, which the Nightingale Club in a village was held, at the sign of the Cabbage and Shears, where the singers no doubt would have greatly excelled, but for want of taste, voices, and ears. Now here, my jolly companions every one, is a working model of a used-up old cheapjack, without a tooth in his head, and with a pain in every bone, so like life that it would be just as good if it wasn't better, just as bad if it wasn't worse, and just as new as if it wasn't worn out. Bid for the working model of the old cheapjack, who has drunk more gunpowder tea with the ladies in his time than would blow the lid off a washerwoman's copper, and carry it as many thousands of miles higher than the moon, as naught nix naught divided by the national debt, carry nothing to the poor rates, 3 under and 2 over. Now, my hearts of oak and men of straw, what d'ye say for the lot? 2 shillings? A shilling? 10 pence? 8 pence? 6 pence? 4 pence? 2 pence? Who said 2 pence? The gentleman in the scarecrow hat? I'm ashamed of the gentleman in the scarecrow hat. I really am ashamed of him for his want of public spirit. Now, I'll tell you what I'll do with you. Come, I'll throw you in a working model of an old woman that was married to the old cheapjack so long ago that upon my word and honour it took place in Noah's Ark, before the unicorn could get in to forbid the banns by blowing a tune upon his horn. There now. Come, what do you say for both? I'll tell you what I'll do with you. I don't bear you malice for being so backward. Here, if you make me a bid that'll only reflect a little credit on your town, I'll throw you in a warming pan for nothing, and lend you a toasting fork for life. Now come, what do you say after that splendid offer? Say £2? Say 30 shillings? Say £1? Say 10 shillings? Say 5? Say 2 and 6? You don't even say 2 and 6. You say 2 and 3. No, You shan't have the lot for 2 and 3. I'd sooner give it to you, if you was good-looking enough. Here, missus, chuck the old man and woman into the cart, put the horse to, drive 'em away, and bury 'em. Such were the last words of Willum Marigold, my own father, and they were carried out, by him and by his wife, my own mother, on one and the same day, as I ought to know, having followed as mourner. My father had been a lovely one in his time at the Cheap Jack work, as his dying observations went to prove. But I top him. I don't say it because it's myself, but because it has been universally acknowledged by all that has had the means of comparison. I've worked at it. I've measured myself against other public speakers, members of Parliament, platforms, pulpits, counsel learned in the law, and where I have found 'em good, I've took a bit of imagination from 'em, and where I've found 'em bad, I've let 'em alone. Now I'll tell you what. I mean to go down into my grave declaring that of all the callings ill-used in Great Britain, the Cheap Jack calling is the worst used. Why ain't we a profession? Why ain't we endowed with privileges? Why are we forced to take out hawkers' licenses, when no such thing is expected of the political hawkers? Where's the difference betwixt us? Except that we are Cheap Jacks, and they are Dear Jacks, I don't see any difference but what's in our favour. For look here. Say it's election time. I am on the footboard of my cart in the marketplace, on a Saturday night. I put up a general miscellaneous lot. I say, "Now, here, my free and independent voters, I am a-going to give you such a chance as you never had in all your born days, nor yet the days preceding. Now I'll show you what I'm going to do with you. Here's a pair of razors that'll shave you closer than the Board of Guardians. Here's a flat iron worth its weight in gold. Here's a frying pan artificially flavoured with essence of beef steaks to that degree that you've only for the rest of your lives to fry bread and dripping in it, and there you are replete with animal food. Here's a genuine chronometer watch, in such a solid silver case that you may knock at the door with it when you come home late from a social meeting, and rouse your wife and family, and save up your knocker for the postman. And here's a dozen dinner plates that you may play the cymbals with to charm the baby when it's fractious. Stop! I'll throw you in another article, and I'll give you that, and it's a rolling pin. And if the baby can only get it well into its mouth when its teeth is coming, and rub the gums once with it, they'll come through double, in a fit of laughter equal to being tickled. Stop again! I'll throw you in another article, because I don't like the looks of you, for you haven't the appearance of buyers, unless I lose by you, and because I'd rather lose than not take money tonight, and that's a looking-glass, in which you may see how ugly you look when you don't bid. What do you say now? Come. Do you say £1? Not you, for you haven't got it. Do you say 10 shillings? Not you, for you owe more to the tallyman. Well then, I'll tell you what I'll do with you. I'll heap 'em all on the footboard of the cart. There they are, razors, flat iron, frying pan, chronometer watch, dinner plates, rolling pin, and looking-glass. Take 'em all away for 4 shillings, and I'll give you 6pence for your trouble. That is me, the Cheap Jack. But on the Monday morning, in the same marketplace, comes the Dear Jack on the hustings, his cart. And what does he say? "Now, my free and independent voters, I am a-going to give you such a chance," he begins just like me, "as you never had in all your born days, and that's the chance of sending myself to Parliament. Now I'll tell you what I'm going to do for you. Here's the interests of this magnificent town promoted above all the rest of the civilized and uncivilized earth. Here's your railways carried and your neighbours' railways jockeyed. Here's all your sons in the post office. Here's Britannia smiling on you. Here's the eyes of Europe on you. Here's the universal prosperity for you, repletion of animal food, golden cornfields, gladsome homesteads, and rounds of applause from your own hearts, all in one lot. And that's myself. Will you take me as I stand? You won't? Well then, I'll tell you what I'll do with you. Come now, I'll throw you in anything you ask for. There. Church rates, abolition of church rates, more malt tax, no malt tax, universal education to the highest mark, or universal ignorance to the lowest, total abolition of flogging in the army, or a dozen for every private once a month all round, wrongs of men or rights of women. Only say which it shall be, take 'em or leave 'em, and I'm of your opinion altogether, and the lot's your own, on your own terms. There. You won't take it yet? Well then, I tell you what I'll do with you. Come, you are such free and independent voters, and I am so proud of you. You are such a noble and enlightened constituency, and I am so ambitious of the honour and dignity of being your member, which is by far the highest level to which the wings of the human mind can soar, that I'll tell you what I'll do with you. I'll throw you in all the public houses in your magnificent town for nothing. Will that content you? It won't? You won't take the lot yet? Well then, before I put the horse in and drive away and make the offer to the next most magnificent town that can be discovered, I'll tell you what I'll do. Take the lot, and I'll drop £2,000 in the streets of your magnificent town for them to pick up that can. Not enough? Now, look here. This is the very furthest that I'm a-going to. I'll make it 2,500. And still you won't? Here, missus, put the horse— No, stop, half a minute. I shouldn't like to turn my back upon you neither for a trifle. I'll make it £2,750. There. Take the lot on your own terms, and I'll count out £2,750 on the footboard of the cart to be dropped in the streets of your magnificent town for them to pick up that can. What do you say? Come now, you won't do better, and you may do worse. You take it. Hooray! Sold again! And got the seat. These dear jacks soap the people shamefully, but we cheap jacks don't. We tell them the truth about themselves to their faces and scorn to court 'em. As to venturesomeness in the way of puffing up the lots, the dear jacks beats us hollow. It is considered in the cheap jack calling that better patter can be made out of a gun than any article we put up from the cart, except a pair of spectacles. I often hold forth about a gun for a quarter of an hour, and feel as if I need never leave off. But when I tell 'em what the gun can do, and what the gun has brought down, I never go half so far as the dear jacks do, when they make speeches in praise of their guns, their great guns, that set 'em on to do it. Besides, I'm in business for myself. I ain't sent down into the marketplace to order, as they are. Besides, again, my guns don't know what I say in their laudation, and their guns do, and the whole concern of 'em have reason to be sick and ashamed all round. These are some of my arguments for declaring that the cheap jack calling is treated ill in Great Britain, and for turning warm when I think of the other jacks in question setting themselves up to pretend to look down upon it. I courted my wife, from the footboard of the cart. I did indeed. She was a Suffolk young woman, and it was in Ipswich market-place, right opposite the corn chandler's shop. I'd noticed her up at a window last Saturday that was, appreciating highly. I took to her, and, as I said to myself, if not already disposed of, I'll have that lot. Next Saturday that come, I pitched the cart on the same pitch, and I was in very high feather indeed, keeping 'em laughing the whole of the time, and getting off the goods briskly. At last I took out my waistcoat pocket a small lot wrapped in soft paper, and I put it this way, looking up at the window where she was. "Now here, my blooming English maidens, is an article, the last article in the present evening's sale, which I offer to only you, the lovely Suffolk dumplings biling over with beauty. And I won't take a bid of £1,000 for it from any man alive. Now what is it? Why, I'll tell you what it is. It's made of fine gold, and it's not broke, though there's a hole in the middle of it. And it's stronger than any fetter that ever was forged, though it's smaller than any finger in my set of 10. Why 10? Because when my parents made over my property to me, I tell you true, there was 12 sheets, 12 towels, 12 tablecloths, 12 knives, 12 forks, 12 tablespoons, and 12 teaspoons. But my set of fingers was too short of a dozen, and could never since be matched. Now what else is it? Come, I'll tell you. It's a hoop of solid gold, wrapped in silver curl paper, that I myself took off the shining locks of the ever-beautiful old lady in Threadneedle Street, London City. I wouldn't tell you so if I hadn't the paper to show, or you mightn't believe it even of me. Now what else is it? It's a man-trap, and a handcuff, the parish stocks, and a leg-lock, all in gold and all in one. Now what else is it? It's a wedding ring. Now I'll tell you what I'm going to do with it. I'm not a-going to offer this lot for money, but I mean to give it to the next of you beauties that laughs. And I'll pay her a visit tomorrow morning at exactly half after 9 o'clock as the chimes go, and I'll take her out for a walk to put up the banns." She laughed, and got the ring handed up to her. When I called in the morning, she says, "Oh, dear, it's never you, and you never mean it." "It's ever me," says I, "and I am ever yours, and ever mean it." So we got married, after being put up 3 times, which, by the by, is quite in the cheapjack way again, and shows once more how the cheapjack customs pervade society. She wasn't a bad wife, but she had a temper. If she could have parted with that one article at a sacrifice, I wouldn't have swapped her away in exchange for any other woman in England. Not that I ever did swap her away, for we lived together till she died, and that was 13 year. Now, my lords and ladies and gentlefolk all, I'll let you into a secret, though you won't believe it. 13 year of temper in a palace would try the worst of you. But 13 year of temper in a cart would try the best of you. You were kept so very close to it in a cart, you see. There's thousands of couples among you getting on like sweet isle upon a whetstone in houses 5 or 6 pairs of stairs high, that would go to the divorce court in a cart. Whether the jolting makes it worse, I don't undertake to decide. But in a cart, it does come home to you, and stick to you. Violence in a cart is so violent, and aggravation in a cart is so aggravating. We might have had such a pleasant life. A roomy cart, with the large goods hung outside, and the bed slung underneath it when on the road, an iron pot and a kettle, a fireplace for the cold weather, a chimney for the smoke, a hanging shelf and a cupboard, a dog and a horse. What more do you want? You draw off upon a bit of turf in a green lane or by the roadside. You hobble your old horse and turn him grazing. You light your fire upon the ashes of the last visitors. You cook your stew, and you wouldn't call the Emperor of France your father. But have a temper in the cart, flinging language and the hardest goods in stock at you, and where are you then? Put a name to your feelings. My dog knew as well when she was on the turn as I did. Before she broke out, he would give a howl and bolt. How he knew it was a mystery to me, but the sure and certain knowledge of it would wake him up out of his soundest sleep, and he would give a howl and bolt. At such times I wished I was him. The worst of it was, we had a daughter born to us, and I loved children with all my heart. When she was in her fury, she beat the child. This got to be so shocking, as the child got to be 4 or 5 years old, that I have many a time gone on with my whip over my shoulder at the old horse's head, sobbing and crying, worse than ever little Sophie did. For how could I prevent it? Such a thing is not to be tried with such a temper, in a cart, without coming to a fight. And in the natural size and formation of a cart, to bring it to a fight. And then the poor child got worse terrified than before, as well as worse hurt generally. And her mother made complaints to the next people we lighted on, and the word went round, "Here's a wretch of a cheapjack being a beating his wife." Little Sophie was such a brave child. She grew to be quite devoted to her poor father, though he could do so little to help her. She had a wonderful quantity of shining dark hair, all curling natural about her. It's quite astonishing to me now that I didn't go tearing mad when I used to see her run from her mother before the cart, and her mother catch her by this hair and pull her down by it and beat her. Such a brave child I said she was. Ah, with reason. "Don't you mind next time, father dear," she would whisper to me, with her little face still flushed and her bright eyes still wet. "If I don't cry out, you may know I'm not much hurt, and even if I do cry out, it will only be to get mother to let go and leave off." What have I seen the little spirit bear, for me, without crying out? Yet in other respects her mother took great care of her. Her clothes were always clean and neat, and her mother was never tired of working at them. Such is the inconsistency in things. Our being down in the marsh country, in unhealthy weather, I consider the cause of Sophie's taking bad low fever. But, however, she took it. Once she got it, she turned away from her mother for evermore, and nothing would persuade her to be touched by her mother's hand. She would shiver and say, "No, no, no," when it was offered at, and would hide her face on my shoulder and hold me tighter round the neck. The cheapjack business had been worse than ever I had known it. What with one thing and what with another, and not least the railroads, which will cut it all to pieces, I expect, at last, and I was run dry of money. For which reason, one night at that period of little Sophie's being so bad, either we must have come to a deadlock for victuals and drink, or I must have pitched the cart as I did. I couldn't get the dear child to lie down or leave go of me, and indeed I hadn't the heart to try. So I stepped out on the footboard with her holding round my neck. They all set up a laugh when they see us, and one chuckle-headed Joskin, that I hated for it, made the bidding, 2pence for her. "Now, you country boobies," says I, feeling as if my heart was a heavy weight at the end of a broken sash line, "I give you notice that I am a-going to charm the money out of your pockets, and to give you so much more than your money's worth that you'll only persuade yourselves to draw your Saturday night's wages over again ever afterwards by the hopes of meeting me to lay 'em out with, which you never will. And why? Because I've made my fortune by selling my goods on a large scale for 75% less than I give for 'em. And I am consequently to be elevated to the House of Peers next week by the title of the Duke of Cheap and Marquis Jackalouro. Now, let's know what you want tonight, and you shall have it. But first of all, shall I tell you why I've got this little girl round my neck? You don't want to know? Then you shall. She belongs to the fairies. She's a fortune-teller. She can tell me all about you in a whisper, and can put me up to whether you're going to buy a lot or leave it. Now, do you want a saw? No, she says, you don't, because you're too clumsy to use one. Else here's a saw which would be a lifelong blessing to a handy man at 4 shillings. At 3 and 6. At 3. At 2 and 6. At 2. At 18 pence. But none of you shall have it at any price, on account of your well-known awkwardness, which would make it manslaughter. The same objection applies to this set of 3 planes, which I won't let you have neither, so don't bid for 'em. Now, I'm a-going to ask her what you do want. Then I whispered, Your head burns so that I'm afraid it hurts you bad, my pet. And she answered, without opening her heavy eyes, Just a little, father. Oh, this little fortune-teller says it's a memorandum book you want. Then why didn't you mention it? Here it is, look at it. 200 superfine, hot-pressed wire-wove pages. If you don't believe me, count 'em. Ready ruled for your expenses. An everlastingly pointed pencil to put 'em down, with a double-bladed penknife to scratch 'em out with. A book of printed tables to calculate your income with, and a camp stool to sit down upon while you give your mind to it. Stop! And an umbrella to keep the moon off you when you give your mind to it on a pitch-dark night. Now, I won't ask how much for the lot, but how little. How little are you thinking of? Don't be ashamed to mention it, because my fortune-teller knows already. Then, making believe to whisper, I kissed her and she kissed me. Why, she says, you are thinking of as little as 3 and 6pence. I couldn't have believed it even of you, unless she told me. 3 and 6pence? 3 and 3pence. And a set of printed tables in the lot that'll calculate your income up to 40,000 a year. With an income of 40,000 a year, you grudge 3 and 6pence? Well then, I'll tell you my opinion. I so despise the 3pence that I'd sooner take 3 shillings. There. For 3 shillings, 3 shillings, 3 shillings. Gone. Hand 'em over to the lucky man. As there had been no bid at all, everybody looked about and grinned at everybody, while I touched little Sophie's face and asked her if she felt faint or giddy. Not very, father. It'll soon be over. Then turning from the pretty patient eyes, which were opened now, and seeing nothing but grins across my lighted grease pot, I went on again in my Cheap Jack style. Where's the butcher? My sorrowful eye had just caught sight of a fat young butcher on the outside of the crowd. She says, The good luck is the butcher's. Where is he? Everybody handed on the blushing butcher to the front, and there was a roar, and the butcher felt himself obliged to put his hand in his pocket and take the lot. The party so picked out in general does feel obliged to take the lot. Good 4 times out of 6. Then we had another lot, the counterpart of that one, and sold it 6pence cheaper, which is always very much enjoyed. Then we had the spectacles. It ain't a special profitable lot, but I put 'em on, and I see what the Chancellor of the Exchequer is going to take off the taxes, and I see what the sweetheart of the young one in the shawl is doing at home, and I see what the bishops has got for dinner, and a deal more that seldom fails to fetch 'em up in their spirits, and the better their spirits, the better their bids. Then we had the ladies' lot. The teapot, tea-caddy, glass sugar basin, 6 spoons, and caudle cup. And all the time I was making similar excuses to give a look or two and say a word or two to my poor child. It was while the second ladies' lot was holding 'em enchained that I felt her lift herself a little on my shoulder and look across the dark street. "What troubles you, my darling?"
"Nothing troubles me, Father. I'm not at all troubled. But don't I see a pretty churchyard over there?"
"Yes, my dear."
"Kiss me twice, dear Father, and lay me down to rest upon that churchyard grass, so soft and green."
I staggered back into the cart with her head dropped on my shoulder, and I says to her mother, "Quick, shut the door. Don't let those laughing people see." "What's the matter?" she cries. "Oh, woman, woman," I tells her, "you'll never catch my little Sophie by her hair again, for she's flown away from you." Maybe those were harder words than I meant 'em, but from that time forth my wife took to brooding, and would sit in the cart or walk beside it hours at a stretch, and her arms crossed, and her eyes looking on the ground. When her furies took her, which was rather seldomer than before, they took her in a new way, and she banged herself about to that extent that I was forced to hold her. She got none the better for a little drink now and then. And through some years I used to wonder, as I plodded along with the old horse's head, whether there were many carts upon the road that held so much dreariness as mine, for all my being looked up to as the king of the cheapjacks. So sad our lives went on, till one summer evening, when, as we were coming into Exeter, out of the farther west of England, we saw a woman beating a child in a cruel manner, who screamed, "Don't beat me! Oh, mother, mother, mother!" And my wife stopped her ears and ran away like a wild thing. And next day she was found in the river. Me and my dog were all the company left in the cart now, and the dog learned to give a short bark when they wouldn't bid, and to give another and a nod of his head when I asked him, "Who said 1/2 crown? Are you the gentleman, sir, that offered 1/2 crown?" He attained to an immense height of popularity, and I shall always believe taught himself entirely out of his own head to growl at any person in the crowd that bid as low as 6pence. But he got to be well on in years, and one night, when I was convulsing York with the spectacles, he took a convulsion on his own account, upon the very footboard by me, and it finished him. Being naturally of a tender turn, I had dreadful lonely feelings on me out of this. I conquered 'em at selling times, having a reputation to keep, not to mention keeping myself, but they got me down in private and rolled upon me. That's often the way with us public characters. See us on the footboard, and you'd give pretty well anything you possess to be us. See us off the footboard, and you'd add a trifle to be off your bargain. It was under these circumstances that I came acquainted with a giant. I might have been too high to fall into conversation with him had it not been for my lonely feelings, for the general rule is, going round the country, to draw the line at dressing up. when a man can't trust to getting his living by his undisguised abilities, you consider him below your sort. And this giant, when on view, figured as a Roman. He was a languid young man, which I attribute to the distance between his extremities. He had a little head, and less in it. He had weak eyes and weak knees, and altogether you couldn't look at him without feeling that there was greatly too much of him, both for his joints and his mind. But he was an amiable, though timid young man. His mother let him out and spent the money, and we come acquainted when he was walking to ease the horses betwixt two fairs. He was called Rinaldo di Valesco, his name being Pickleson. This giant, otherwise Pickleson, mentioned to me, under the seal of confidence, that, beyond his being a burden to himself, his life was made a burden to him by the cruelty of his master towards a stepdaughter who was deaf and dumb. Her mother was dead, and she had no living soul to take her part, and was used most hard. She travelled with his master's caravan, only because there was nowhere else to leave her, and this giant, otherwise Pickleson, did go so far as to believe that his master often tried to lose her. He was such a very languid young man that I don't know how long it didn't take him to get this story out, but it passed through his defective circulation to his top extremity in the course of time. When I heard this account from the giant, otherwise Pickleson, and likewise that the poor girl had beautiful long dark hair, and was often pulled down by it and beaten, I couldn't see the giant through what stood in my eyes. Having wiped him, I give him 6pence, for he was kept as short as he was long, and he laid it out in 2-3 penn'orths of gin and water, which so brisked him up that he sang the favourite comic of "Shivery shaky, ain't it cold?" a popular effect which his master had tried every other means to get out of him as a Roman wholly in vain. His master's name was Mim, a wary horseman, and I knew him to speak to. I went to that fair as a mere civilian, leaving the cart outside the town, and I looked about the back of the vans while the performing was going on, and at last, sitting dozing against a muddy cart-wheel, I came upon the poor girl who was deaf and dumb. At the first look, I might almost have judged that she had escaped from a wild beast show. But at the second I thought better of her, and thought that if she was more cared for and more kindly used, she would be like my child. She was just the same age that my own daughter would have been, if her pretty head had not fell down upon my shoulder that unfortunate night. To cut it short, I spoke confidential to Mim when he was beating the gong outside twixt the two lots of Pickleson's publics, and I put it to him. "She lies heavy on your own hands. What'll you take for her?" Mim was a most ferocious swearer. Suppressing that part of his reply, which was much the longest part, his reply was, "A pair of braces." "Now I'll tell you," says I, "what I'm going to do with you. I'm a-going to fetch you 6 pair of the primest braces in the cart, and then to take her away with me." Says Mim, again ferocious, "I'll believe it when I've got the goods, and no sooner." I made all the haste I could, lest he should think twice of it, and the bargain was completed, which Pickleson, he was thereby so relieved in his mind that he come out at his little back door long ways like a serpent, and gives a shivery shaky in a whisper among the wheels at parting. It was happy days for both of us, when Sophie and me began to travel in the cart. I at once give her the name of Sophie, to put her ever towards me in the attitude of my own daughter. We soon made out to begin to understand one another, through the goodness of the heavens, when she knowed that I meant true and kind by her. In a very little time she was wonderfully fond of me. You've no idea what it is to have anybody wonderful fond of you, unless you've been got down and rolled upon by the lonely feelings that I've mentioned as having once got the better of me. You'd have laughed, or the reverse, that's according to your disposition, if you could have seen me trying to teach Sophie. At first I was helped, you'd never guess by what, milestones. I got some large alphabets in a box, all the letters separate on bits of bone, and saying we was going to Windsor, I give her those letters in that order, and then at every milestone I showed her those same letters in that same order again, and pointed towards the abode of royalty. Another time I gave her card, and then chalked the same upon the card. Another time I gave her Dr. Marigold, and hung a corresponding inscription outside my waistcoat. People that met us might stare a bit and laugh, but what did I care if she caught the idea? She caught it after long patience and trouble, and then we did begin to get on swimmingly, I believe you. At first she was a little given to consider me the cart, and the cart the abode of royalty, but that soon wore off. We had our signs, too, and they were hundreds in number. Sometimes she would sit looking at me and considering hard how to communicate me about something fresh, how to ask me what she wanted explained. And then she was, or I thought she was, what does it signify, so like my child, with those years added to her, that I half believed it was herself, trying to tell me where she had been, up to the skies, and what she had seen since that unhappy night when she flied away. She had a pretty face, and now that there was no one to drag at her bright dark hair, it was all in order, and there was something touching in her looks that made the cart most peaceful and most quiet, though not at all melancholy. N.B. In the cheap-jack patter, we generally sound it lemon jolly, and it gets a laugh. The way she learned to understand any look of mine was truly surprising. When I sold of a night, she would sit in the cart unseen by them outside, and would give an eager look into my eyes when I looked in, and would hand me straight the precise article or articles I wanted. And then she would clap her hands and laugh for joy. And as for me, seeing her so bright, and remembering what she was when I first lighted on her, starved and beaten and ragged, leaning asleep against the muddy cart-wheel, it gave me such heart that I gained a greater height in reputation than ever. And I put Pickleson down, by the name of Mim's travelling giant, otherwise Pickleson, for a 5-pound note in my will. This happiness went on in the cart till she was 16 years old, by which time I began to feel not satisfied that I'd done my whole duty by her, and to consider that she ought to have better teaching than I could give her. It drew many tears on both sides when I commenced explaining my views to her. But what's right is right, and you can't, neither by tears nor laughter, do away with its character. So I took her hand in mine, and I went with her one day to the deaf and dumb establishment in London. And when the gentleman come to speak to us, I says to him, "Now I'll tell you what I'll do with you, sir. I'm nothing but a cheap jack, but of late years I've laid by for a rainy day notwithstanding. This is my only daughter, adopted, and you can't produce a deafer nor a dumber. Teach her the most that can be taught her, in the shortest separation that can be named, state the figure for it, and I'm game to put the money down. I won't bate you a single farthing. Sir, but I'll put the money down here and now, and I'll thankfully throw you in a pound to take it. There." The gentleman smiled, and then, "Well, well," says he, "I must first know what she has learned already. How do you communicate with her?" Then I showed him, and she wrote in printed writing many names of things and so forth, and we held some sprightly conversation, Sophie and me, about a little story in a book which the gentleman showed her, and which she was able to read. "This is most extraordinary," says the gentleman. "Is it possible that you have been her only teacher?" "I have been her only teacher, sir," I says, "besides herself." "Then," says the gentleman, and more acceptable words was never spoken to me, "you're a clever fellow, and a good fellow." This he makes known to Sophie, who kisses his hands, clasps her own, and laughs and cries upon it. We saw the gentleman 4 times in all, and when he took down my name and asked how in the world it ever chanced to be Doctor, it came out that he was own nephew by the sister's side, if you'll believe me, to the very doctor that I was called after. This made our footing still easier, and he says to me, "Now, Marigold, tell me what more do you want your adopted daughter to know?" "I want her, sir, to be cut off from the world as little as can be, considering her deprivations, and therefore to be able to read whatever is wrote with perfect ease and pleasure." "My good fellow," urges the gentleman, opening his eyes wide, "why, I can't do that myself." I took his joke, and gave him a laugh, knowing by experience how flat you fall without it, and I mended my words accordingly. "What do you mean to do with her afterwards?" asked the gentleman, with a sort of doubtful eye. "To take her about the country?" "In the cart, sir, but only in the cart. She will live a private life, you understand, in the cart. I should never think of bringing her infirmities before the public. I wouldn't make a show of her for any money." The gentleman nodded and seemed to approve. "Well," says he, "can you part with her for 2 years?" "To do her that good?" "Yes, sir." "There's another question," says the gentleman, looking towards her. "Can she part with you for 2 years?" I don't know that it was a harder matter of itself, for the other was hard enough to me, but it was harder to get over. However, she was pacified to it at the last, and the separation betwixt us was settled. How it cut up both of us when it took place, and when I left her at the door in the dark of an evening, I don't tell. But I know this. Remembering that night, I shall never pass that same establishment without a heartache and a swelling in the throat. And I couldn't put you up the best of lots in sight of it with my usual spirit. No, not even the gun or the pair of spectacles, for £500 reward from the Secretary of State for the Home Department, and throw in the honour of putting my legs under his mahogany afterwards. Still, the loneliness that followed in the cart was not the old loneliness, because there was a term put to it, however long to look forward to, and because I could think, when I was anyways down, that she belonged to me, and I belonged to her. All was planning for her coming back. I bought in a few months' time another cart, and what do you think I planned to do with it? I'll tell you. I planned to fit it up with shelves and books for her reading, and to have a seat in it where I could sit and see her read, and think that I had been her first teacher. Not hurrying over the job, I had the fittings knocked together in contriving ways under my own inspection, and here was her bed in a berth with curtains, and there was her reading table, and here was her writing desk, and elsewhere was her books in rows upon rows, pictures or no pictures, bindings and no bindings, gilt-edged and plain, just as I could pick 'em up for her in lots up and down the country. North and south and west and east, winds liked best and winds liked least, here and there and gone astray, over the hills and far away. And when I'd got together pretty well as many books as the cart would neatly hold, a new scheme came into my head, which, as it turned out, kept my time and attention a good deal employed, and helped me over the 2 years' style. Without being of an avaricious temper, I like to be the owner of things. I shouldn't wish, for instance, to go partners with yourself in the cheapjack cart. It's not that I mistrust you, but that I rather like to know it was mine. Similarly, very likely you would rather know it was yours. Well, a kind of jealousy began to creep into my mind when I reflected that all those books would have been read by other people, long before they was read by her. It seemed to take away from her being the owner of 'em, like. In this way, the question got into my head, couldn't I have a book new made, express for her, which she should be the first to read? It pleased me, that thought did, and as I never was a man to let a thought sleep, you must wake up all the whole family of thoughts, and you've got to burn their nightcaps or you won't do in the cheapjack line, I set to work at it. Considering that I was in the habit of changing so much about the country, and that I should have to find a literary character here and make a deal with, and another literary character there to make a deal with, as opportunities presented, I hit on the plan that this same book should be a general miscellaneous lot, like the razors, flat iron, chronometer watch, dinner plates, rolling pin, and looking-glass, and shouldn't be offered as a single individual article, like the spectacles or the gun. When I'd come to that conclusion, I came to another, which shall likewise be yours. Often I had regretted that she never had heard me on the footboard, and that she never could hear me. It ain't that I'm vain, but that you don't like to put your own light under a bushel. What's the worth of your reputation if you can't convey the reason for it to the person you most wish to value it? Now I'll put it to you. Is it worth 6pence? 5pence? 4pence? 3pence? 2pence? A penny? A halfpenny? A farthing? No, it ain't. It's not worth a farthing. Very well, then. My conclusion was that I would begin her book with some account of myself, so that, through reading a specimen or two of me on the footboard, she might form an idea of my merits there. I was aware that I couldn't do myself justice. A man can't write his eye. At least I don't know how to. Nor yet can a man write his voice, nor the rate of his talk, nor the quickness of his action, nor his general spicy way. But he can write his turns of speech, when he is a public speaker. And indeed, I've heard that he very often does before he speaks 'em. Well, having formed that resolution, then came the question of a name. How did I hammer that hot iron into shape? This way. The most difficult explanation I had ever had with her was how I come to be called doctor, and yet was no doctor. After all, I felt that I'd failed of getting it correctly into her mind with my utmost pains. But, trusting to her improvement in the 2 years, I thought that I might trust to her understanding it when she should come to read it as put down by my own hand. Then I thought I would try a joke with her, and watch how it took, by which of itself I might fully judge of her understanding it. We'd first discovered the mistake we had dropped into, through her having asked me to prescribe for her, when she had supposed me to be a doctor in a medical point of view. So I thinks, now, if I give this book the name of my prescriptions. And if she catches the idea that my only prescriptions are for her amusement and interest, to make her laugh in a pleasant way, or to make her cry in a pleasant way, it'll be a delightful proof to both of us that we have got over our difficulty. It fell out to absolute perfection. For when she saw the book, as I'd got it up, the printed and pressed book, lying on her desk in her cart, and saw the title, Dr. Marigold's Prescriptions, she looked at me for a moment with astonishment, then fluttered the leaves, then broke out laughing in the charmingest way, then felt her pulse and shook her head, then turned the pages, pretending to read them most attentive, then kissed the book to me, and put it to her bosom with both her hands. I never was better pleased in all my life. But let me not anticipate. I take that expression out of a lot of romances I bought for her. I never opened a single one of them, and I've opened many, but I found the romancer saying, "Let me not anticipate." Which being so, I wonder why he did anticipate, or who asked him to do it. Let me not, I say, anticipate. This same book took up all my spare time. It was no play to get the other articles together in the general miscellaneous lot, but when it came to my own article, there, I couldn't have believed the blotting, nor yet the buckling to at it, nor the patience over it. Which again is like the footboard. The public have no idea. At last it was done, and the 2 years' time was gone, after all the other times before it. And where it's all gone to, who knows? The new cart was finished, yellow outside, relieved with vermilion and brass fittings. The old horse was put in, a new one and a boy being laid on for the cheapjack cart, and I cleaned myself up to go and fetch her. Bright cold weather it was, cart chimneys smoking, carts pitched private on a piece of waste ground over at Wandsworth, where you may see 'em from the South Western Railway when not on the road. Look out of the right-hand window going down. "Marigold," says the gentleman, giving his hand hearty, "I am very glad to see you." "Yet I have my doubts, sir," says I, "if you can be half so glad to see me as I am to see you." "The time has appeared so long, has it, Marigold?" "I won't say that, sir, considering its real length, but—" "What a start, my good fellow!" "Ah, I should think it was. Grown such a woman, so pretty, so intelligent, so expressive. I knew then that she must really be like my child, or I could never have known her standing quiet by the door." "You are affected," says the gentleman in a kindly manner. "I feel, sir," says I, "that I am but a rough chap in a sleeved waistcoat." "I feel," says the gentleman, "that it was you who raised her from misery and degradation, and brought her into communication with her kind. But why do we converse alone together, when we can converse so well with her? Address her in your own way." "I'm such a rough chap in a sleeved waistcoat, sir," says I, "and she is such a graceful woman, and she stands so quiet at the door." "Try if she moves at the old sign," says the gentleman. They'd got it up together, a purpose to please me. For when I gave her the old sign, she rushed to my feet and dropped upon her knees, holding up her hands to me with pouring tears of love and joy. And when I took her hands and lifted her, she clasped me round the neck, and lay there, and I don't know what a fool I didn't make of myself, until we all three settled down into talking without sound, as if there was a something soft and pleasant spread over the whole world for us. A portion is here omitted from the text, having reference to the sketches contributed by other writers. But the reader will be pleased to have what follows retained as a note. Now I'll tell you what I am a-going to do with you. I am a-going to offer you the General Miscellaneous Lot, her own book, never read by anybody else but me, added to and completed by me after her first reading of it, 48 printed pages, 96 columns, Whiting's own work, Beaufort House to wit, thrown off by the steam engine, best of paper, beautiful green wrapper, folded like clean linen come home from the clear starches, and so exquisitely stitched that, regarded as a piece of needlework alone, it's better than the sampler of a seamstress undergoing a competitive examination for starvation before the Civil Service Commissioners. And I offer the lot for what? For £8? Not so much. For £6? Less. For £4? Why, I hardly expect you to believe me, but that's the sum. £4. The stitching alone cost half as much again. Here's 48 original pages, 96 original columns for £4. You want more for the money? Take it. 3 whole pages of advertisements of thrilling interest thrown in for nothing. Read 'em and believe 'em. More? My best wishes for your Merry Christmases and your Happy New Years, your long lives and your true prosperities. Worth £20 good, if they're delivered as I send 'em. Remember? Here's a final prescription added, to be taken for life, which will tell you how the cart broke down and where the journey ended. You think £4 too much? And still you think so? Come, I'll tell you what then. Say 4 pence, and keep the secret. Chapter 2. To be taken with a grain of salt. I have always noticed a prevalent want of courage, even among persons of superior intelligence and culture, as to imparting their own psychological experiences when those have been of a strange sort. Almost all men are afraid that what they could relate, in such wise, would find no parallel or response in a listener's internal life, and might be suspected or laughed at. A truthful traveller, who should have seen some extraordinary creature in the likeness of a sea-serpent, would have no fear of mentioning it. But the same traveller, having had some singular presentiment, impulse, vagary of thought, vision, so-called, dream, or other remarkable mental impression, would hesitate considerably before he would own to it. To this reticence I attribute much of the obscurity in which such subjects are involved. We do not habitually communicate our experiences of these subjective things as we do our experiences of objective creation. The consequence is that the general stock of experience in this regard appears exceptional, and really is so, in respect of being miserably imperfect. In what I am going to relate, I have no intention of setting up, opposing, or supporting any theory whatsoever. I know the history of the bookseller of Berlin. I have studied the case of the wife of a late Astronomer Royal, as related by Sir David Brewster. And I have followed the minutest details of a much more remarkable case of spectral illusion occurring within my private circle of friends. It may be necessary to state, as to this last, that the sufferer, a lady, was in no degree, however distant, related to me. A mistaken assumption on that head might suggest an explanation of a part of my own case, but only a part, which would be wholly without foundation. It cannot be referred to my inheritance of any developed peculiarity, nor had I ever before any at all similar experience, nor have I ever had any at all similar experience since. It does not signify how many years ago, or how few, a certain murder was committed in England which attracted great attention. We hear more than enough of murderers as they rise in succession to their atrocious eminence, and I would bury the memory of this particular brute, if I could, as his body was buried in Newgate jail. I purposely abstain from giving any direct clue to the criminal's individuality. When the murder was first discovered, no suspicion fell, or I ought rather to say, for I cannot be too precise in my facts, it was nowhere publicly hinted that any suspicion fell, on the man who was afterwards brought to trial. As no reference was at that time made to him in the newspapers, it is obviously impossible that any description of him can at that time have been given in the newspapers. It is essential that this fact be remembered. Unfolding at breakfast my morning paper, containing the account of that first discovery, I found it to be deeply interesting, and I read it with close attention. I read it twice, if not 3 times. The discovery had been made in a bedroom, and when I laid down the paper, I was aware of a flash, rush, flow, I do not know what to call it, no word I can find is satisfactorily descriptive, in which I seemed to see that bedroom passing through my room like a picture impossibly painted on a running river. Though almost instantaneous in its passing, it was perfectly clear, so clear that I distinctly, and with a sense of relief, observed the absence of the dead body from the bed. It was in no romantic place that I had this curious sensation, but in chambers in Piccadilly, very near to the corner of St. James's Street. It was entirely new to me. I was in my easy chair at the moment, and the sensation was accompanied with a peculiar shiver which started the chair from its position. But it is to be noted that the chair ran easily on casters. I went to one of the windows. There are 2 in the room, and the room is on the 2nd floor, to refresh my eyes with the moving objects down in Piccadilly. It was a bright autumn morning, and the streets were sparkling and cheerful. The wind was high. As I looked out, it brought down from the park a quantity of fallen leaves, which a gust took and whirled into a spiral pillar. As the pillar fell and the leaves dispersed, I saw 2 men on the opposite side of the way, going from west to east. They were one behind the other. The foremost man often looked back over his shoulder. The second man followed him, at a distance of some 30 paces, with his right hand menacingly raised. First, the singularity and steadiness of this threatening gesture in so public a thoroughfare attracted my attention, and next, the more remarkable circumstance that nobody heeded it. Both men threaded their way among the other passengers with a smoothness hardly consistent even with the action of walking on a pavement, and no single creature that I could see gave them place, touched them, or looked after them. In passing before my windows, they both stared up at me. I saw their 2 faces very distinctly, and I knew that I could recognize them anywhere. Not that I had consciously noticed anything very remarkable in either face, except that the man who went first had an unusually lowering appearance, and that the face of the man who followed him was the colour of impure wax. I am a bachelor, and my valet and his wife constitute my whole establishment. My occupation is in a certain branch bank, and I wish that my duties as head of a department were as light as they are popularly supposed to be. They kept me in town that autumn, when I stood in need of change. I was not ill, but I was not well. My reader is to make the most that can be reasonably made of my feeling jaded, having a depressing sense upon me of a monotonous life, and being slightly dyspeptic. I am assured by my renowned doctor that my real state of health at that time justifies no stronger description, and I quote his own from his written answer to my request for it. As the circumstances of the murder, gradually unravelling, took stronger and stronger possession of the public mind, I kept them away from mine by knowing as little about them as was possible in the midst of the universal excitement. But I knew that a verdict of wilful murder had been found against the suspected murderer, and that he had been committed for trial for Newgate. I also knew that his trial had been postponed over 1 sessions of the Central Criminal Court on the ground of general prejudice and want of time for the preparation of the defence. I may further have known, but I believe I did not, when, or about when, the sessions to which his trial stood postponed would come on. My sitting-room, bedroom, and dressing-room are all on one floor. With the last there is no communication but through the bedroom. True, there is a door in it, once communicating with the staircase, but a part of the fitting of my bath has been, and had been for some years, fixed across it. At the same period, and as part of the same arrangement, the door had been nailed up and canvassed over. I was standing in my bedroom late one night, giving some directions to my servant before he went to bed. My face was towards the only available door of communication with the dressing-room, and it was closed. My servant's back was towards that door. While I was speaking to him, I saw it open, and a man look in, who very earnestly and mysteriously beckoned to me. That man was the man who had gone second of the 2 along Piccadilly, and whose face was the colour of impure wax. The figure, having beckoned, drew back and closed the door. With no longer pause than was made by my crossing the bedroom, I opened the dressing-room door and looked in. I had a lighted candle already in my hand. I felt no inward expectation of seeing the figure in the dressing-room, and I did not see it there. Conscious that my servant stood amazed, I turned round to him and said, "Derek, could you believe that in my cool senses I fancy I saw a—" As I there laid my hand upon his breast, with a sudden start he trembled violently and said, "Oh, Lord, yes, sir, a dead man beckoning." Now, I do not believe that this John Derrick, my trusty and attached servant for more than 20 years, had any impression whatever of having seen any such figure until I touched him. The change in him was so startling, when I touched him, that I fully believed he derived his impression in some occult manner from me at that instant. I bade John Derrick bring some brandy, and I gave him a dram, and was glad to take one myself. Of what had preceded that night's phenomenon, I told him not a single word. Reflecting on it, I was absolutely certain that I had never seen that face before, except on the one occasion in Piccadilly. Comparing its expression, when beckoning at the door, with its expression when it had stared up at me as I stood at my window, I came to the conclusion that on the first occasion it had sought to fasten itself upon my memory, and that on the second occasion it had made sure of being immediately remembered. I was not very comfortable that night, though I felt a certainty, difficult to explain, that the figure would not return. At daybreak I fell into a heavy sleep, from which I was awakened by John Derrick's coming to my bedside with a paper in his hand. This paper, it appeared, had been the subject of an altercation at the door between its bearer and my servant. It was a summons to me to serve upon a jury at the forthcoming sessions of the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. I had never before been summoned on such a jury, as John Derrick well knew. He believed, I am not certain at this hour, whether with what reason or otherwise, that the class of jurors were customarily chosen on a lower qualification than mine, and he had at first refused to accept the summons. The man who served it had taken the matter very coolly. He had said that my attendance or non-attendance was nothing to him. There the summons was, and I should deal with it at my own peril and not at his. For a day or two I was undecided whether to respond to this call or take no notice of it. I was not conscious of the slightest mysterious bias, influence, or attraction, one way or another. Of that I am as strictly sure as of every other statement that I make here. Ultimately I decided, as a break in the monotony of my life, that I would go. The appointed morning was a raw morning in the month of November. There was a dense fog, brown fog in Piccadilly, and it became positively black, and in the last degree oppressive, east of Temple Bar. I found the passages and staircases of the courthouse flaringly lighted with gas, and the court itself similarly illuminated. I think that, until I was conducted by officers into the old court, and saw its crowded state, I did not know that the murderer was to be tried that day. I think that, until I was so helped into the old court, with considerable difficulty, I did not know into which of the two courts sitting my summons would take me. But this must not be received as a positive assertion, for I am not completely satisfied in my mind on either point. I took my seat in the place appropriated to jurors in waiting, and I looked about the court as well as I could through the cloud of fog and breath that was heavy in it. I noticed the black vapour hanging like a murky curtain outside the great windows, and I noticed the stifled sound of the wheels on the straw or tan that was littered in the street. Also the hum of the people gathered there, with which a shrill whistle or a louder song or hail than the rest occasionally pierced. Soon afterwards the judges, 2 in number, entered and took their seats. The buzz in the court was awfully hushed. The direction was given to put the murderer to the bar. He appeared there, and in that same instant I recognized him as the first of the 2 men who had gone down Piccadilly. If my name had been called then, I doubt if I could have answered to it audibly. But it was called about 6th or 8th in the panel, and I was by that time able to say "here." Now observe. As I stepped into the box, the prisoner, who had been looking on attentively, but with no sign of concern, became violently agitated, and beckoned to his attorney. The prisoner's wish to challenge me was so manifest that it occasioned a pause, during which the attorney, with his hand upon the dock, whispered with his client and shook his head. I afterwards had it from that gentleman that the prisoner's first affrighted words to him were, "At all hazards challenge that man." But that, as he could give no reason for it, and admitted that he had not even known my name until he heard it called and I appeared, it was not done. Both on the ground already explained, that I wished to avoid reviving the unwholesome memory of that murderer, and also because a detailed account of his long trial is by no means indispensable to my narrative, I shall confine myself closely to such incidents in the 10 days and nights during which we, the jury, were kept together, as directly bear on my own curious personal experience. It is in that, and not in the murderer, that I seek to interest my reader. It is to that, and not to a page of the Newgate calendar, that I beg attention. I was chosen foreman of the jury. On the second morning of the trial, after evidence had been taken for 2 hours, I heard the church clock strike. Happening to cast my eyes over my brother jurymen, I found an inexplicable difficulty in counting them. I counted them several times, yet always with the same difficulty. In short, I made them 1 too many. I touched the brother juryman whose place was next me, and I whispered to him, "Oblige me by counting us." He looked surprised by the request, but turned his head and counted. "Why," says he suddenly, "we are But no, it's impossible. No, we are 12. According to my counting that day, we were always right in detail, but in the gross we were always one too many. There was no appearance, no figure, to account for it, but I had now an inward foreshadowing of the figure that was surely coming. The jury were housed at the London Tavern. We all slept in one large room on separate tables, and we were constantly in the charge and under the eye of the officer sworn to hold us in safe keeping. I see no reason for suppressing the real name of that officer. He was an intelligent, highly polite and obliging, and, I was glad to hear, much respected in the city. He had an agreeable presence, good eyes, enviable black whiskers, and a fine sonorous voice. His name was Mr. Harker. When we turned into our 12 beds at night, Mr. Harker's bed was drawn across the door. On the night of the second day, not being disposed to lie down, and seeing Mr. Harker sitting on his bed, I went and sat down beside him, and offered him a pinch of snuff. As Mr. Harker's hand touched mine, in taking it from my box, a peculiar shiver crossed him, and he said, "Who is this?" Following Mr. Harker's eyes, and looking along the room, I saw again the figure I expected, the second of the two men who had gone down Piccadilly. I rose and advanced a few steps, then stopped and looked round at Mr. Harker. He was quite unconcerned, laughed, and said in a pleasant way, "I thought for a moment we had a 13th juryman without a bed, but I see it is the moonlight." Making no revelation to Mr. Harker, but inviting him to take a walk with me to the end of the room, I watched what the figure did. It stood for a few moments by the bedside of each of my 11 brother jurymen, close to the pillow. It always went to the right-hand side of the bed, and always passed out, crossing the foot of the next bed. It seemed, from the action of the head, merely to look down pensively at each recumbent figure. It took no notice of me, or of my bed, which was that nearest to Mr. Harker's. It seemed to go out where the moonlight came in, through a high window, as by an aerial flight of stairs. Next morning at breakfast, it appeared that everybody present had dreamt of the murdered man last night, except myself and Mr. Harker. I now felt as convinced that the second man who had gone down Piccadilly was the murdered man, so to speak, as if it had been borne into my comprehension by his immediate testimony. But even this took place, and in a manner for which I was not at all prepared. On the 5th day of the trial, when the case for the prosecution was drawing to a close, a miniature of the murdered man, missing from his bedroom upon the discovery of the deed, and afterwards found in a hiding-place where the murderer had been seen digging, was put in evidence. Having been identified by the witness under examination, it was handed up to the bench, and thence handed down to be inspected by the judge. As an officer in a black gown was making his way with it across to me, the figure of the second man who had gone down Piccadilly impetuously started from the crowd, caught the miniature from the officer, and gave it to me with his own hands, at the same time saying in a low and hollow tone, before I saw the miniature, which was in a locket, "I was younger then, and my face was not then drained of blood." It also came between me and the brother juryman to whom I would have given the miniature, and between him and the brother juryman to whom he would have given it, and so passed it on through the whole of our number and back into my possession. Not one of them, however, detected this. At table, and generally when we were shut up together in Mr. Harker's custody, we had, from the first, naturally discussed the day's proceedings a good deal. On that 5th day, the case for the prosecution being closed, and we having that side of the question in a completed shape before us, our discussion was more animated and serious. Among our number was a vestryman, the densest idiot I have ever seen at large, who met the plainest evidence with the most preposterous objections. and who was sided with by two flabby parochial parasites. All the three impanelled from a district so delivered over to fever that they ought to have been upon their own trial for 500 murders. When these mischievous blockheads were at their loudest, which was towards midnight, while some of us were already preparing for bed, I again saw the murdered man. He stood grimly behind them, beckoning to me. On my going towards them and striking into the conversation, he immediately retired. This was the beginning of a separate series of appearances, confined to that long room in which we were confined. Whenever a knot of my brother jurymen laid their heads together, I saw the head of the murdered man amongst theirs. Whenever their comparison of notes was going against him, he would solemnly and irresistibly beckon to me. It will be borne in mind that down to the production of the miniature, on the 5th day of the trial, I had never seen the appearance in court. 3 changes occurred now that we entered on to the case for the defence. 2 of them I will mention together first. The figure was now in court continually, and it never there addressed itself to me, but always to the person who was speaking at that time. For instance, the throat of the murdered man had been cut straight across. The opening speech for the defence, it was suggested that the deceased might have cut his own throat. At that very moment, the figure, with its throat in the dreadful condition referred to, this it had concealed before, stood at the speaker's elbow, motioning across and across its windpipe, now with the right hand, now with the left, vigorously suggesting to the speaker himself the impossibility of such a wound having been self-inflicted by either hand. For another instance, a witness to character, a woman, deposed to the prisoners being the most amiable of mankind. The figure, at that instant, stood on the floor before her, looking her full in the face, and pointing out the prisoner's evil countenance with an extended arm and an outstretched finger. The third change, now to be added, impressed me strongly as the most marked and striking of all. I do not theorize upon it, I accurately state it, and there leave it. Although the appearance was not itself perceived by those whom it addressed, its coming close to such persons was invariably attended by some trepidation or disturbance on their part. It seemed to me as if it were prevented, by laws to which I was not amenable, from fully revealing itself to others, and yet as if it could, invisibly, dumbly, and darkly, overshadow their minds. When the leading counsel for the defence suggested that hypothesis of suicide, and the figure stood at the learned gentleman's elbow, frightfully sawing at the severed throat, it is undeniable that the counsel faltered in his speech, lost for a few seconds the thread of his ingenious discourse, wiped his forehead with his handkerchief, and turned extremely pale. When the witness to character was confronted by the appearance, her eyes most certainly did follow the direction of its pointed finger, and rest in great hesitation and trouble upon the prisoner's face. 2 additional illustrations will suffice. On the 8th day of the trial, after the pause, which was every day made early in the afternoon for a few minutes' rest and refreshment, I came back into court with the rest of the jury some little time before the return of the judges. Standing up in the box and looking about me, I thought the figure was not there, until, chancing to raise my eyes to the gallery, I saw it bending forward and leaning over a very decent woman, as if to assure itself whether the judges had resumed their seats or not. Immediately afterwards, that woman screamed, fainted, and was carried out. So with the venerable, sagacious, and patient judge who conducted the trial. When the case was over, and he settled himself and his papers to sum up, the murdered man, entering by the judge's door, advanced to his lordship's desk, and looked eagerly over his shoulder at the pages of his notes which he was turning. A change came over his lordship's face. His hand stopped. The peculiar shiver that I knew so well passed over him. He faltered, "Excuse me, gentlemen, for a few moments. I am somewhat oppressed by the vitiated air," and did not recover until he had drunk a glass of water. Through all the monotony of 6 of those interminable 10 days, the same judges and others on the bench, the same murderer in the dock, the same lawyers at the table, the same tones of question and answer rising to the roof of the court, the same scratching of the judge's pen, the same ushers going in and out, the same lights kindled at the same hour, when there had been any natural light of day, the same foggy curtain outside the great windows when it was foggy, the same rain pattering and dripping when it was rainy, the same footmarks of turnkeys and prisoner day after day on the same sawdust, the same keys locking and unlocking the same heavy doors. Through all the wearisome monotony, which made me feel as if I had been foreman of the jury for a vast period of time, and Piccadilly had flourished coevally with Babylon, the murdered man had never lost one trace of his distinctness in my eyes, nor was he at any moment less distinct than anybody else. I must not omit, as a matter of fact, that I never once saw the appearance which I call by the name of the murdered man look at the murderer. Again and again I wondered, why does he not? But he never did. Nor did he look at me, after the production of the miniature, until the last closing minutes of the trial arrived. We retired to consider at 7 minutes before 10 at night. The idiotic vestryman and his 2 parochial parasites gave us so much trouble that we twice returned into court to beg to have certain extracts from the judge's notes re-read. 9 of us had not the smallest doubt about those passages. Neither, I believe, had anyone in the court. The dunder-headed triumvirate, however, having no idea but obstruction, disputed them for that very reason. At length we prevailed, and finally the jury returned into court at 10 minutes past 12. The murdered man at that time stood directly opposite the jury box, on the other side of the court. As I took my place, his eyes rested on me with great attention. He seemed satisfied, and slowly shook a great grey veil, which he carried on his arm for the first time, over his head and whole form. As I gave in our verdict, guilty, the veil collapsed. All was gone, and his place was empty. The murderer, being asked by the judge, according to usage, whether he had anything to say before sentence of death should be passed upon him, indistinctly muttered something which was described in the leading newspapers of the following day as a few rambling, incoherent, and half-audible words, in which he was understood to complain that he had not had a fair trial because the foreman of the jury was prepossessed against him. The remarkable declaration that he really made was this: "My lord, I knew I was a doomed man when the foreman of my jury came into the box. My lord, I knew he would never let me off, because, before I was taken, he somehow got to my bedside in the night, woke me, and put a rope round my neck." Chapter 3. To be taken for life. So every item of my plan was crowned with success. Our reunited life was more than all that we had looked forward to. Content and joy went with us as the wheels of the 2 carts went round, and the same stopped with us when the 2 carts stopped. I was as pleased and as proud as a pug dog with his muzzle black-leaded for an evening party and his tail extra curled by machinery. But I had left something out of my calculations. Now, what had I left out? To help you to guess, I'll say a figure. Come, make a guess and guess right. 0? No. 9? No. 8? No. 7? No. 6? No. 5? No. 4? No. 3? No. 2? No. 1? No. No. Now I'll tell you what I'll do with it. I'll say it's another sort of figure altogether. There. Why then, says you, it's a mortal figure. No, nor yet a mortal figure. By such means you get yourself penned into a corner, and you can't help guessing an immortal figure. That's about it. Why didn't you say so sooner? Yes, it was an immortal figure that I had altogether left out of my calculations. Neither man's nor woman's, but a child's. Girl or boy's? A boy's. I, said the sparrow, with my bow and arrow. Now you've got it. We were down at Lancaster, and I had done 2 nights more than fair average business, though I cannot in honour recommend them as a quick audience, in the open square there, near the end of the street where Mr. Sly's King's Arms and Royal Hotel stands. Mim's travelling giant, otherwise Pickleson, happened at the self-same time to be trying it on in the town. The genteel lay was adopted with him. No hint of a van. Green baize alcove leading up to Pickleson in an auction room. Printed poster. Free list suspended, with the exception of that proud boast of an enlightened country, a free press. Schools admitted by private arrangement. Nothing to raise a blush in the cheek of youth or shock the most fastidious. Mim swearing most horrible and terrific in a pink calico pay place at the slackness of the public. Serious handbill in the shops, importing that it was all but impossible to come to a right understanding of the history of David without seeing Pickleson. I went to the auction room in question, and I found it entirely empty of everything but echoes and mouldiness, with a single exception of Pickleson on a piece of red drugget. This suited my purpose, as I wanted a private and confidential word with him, which was, Pickleson, owing much happiness to you, I put you in my will for a £5 note, but to save trouble, here's £4 down, which may equally suit your views, and let us so conclude the transaction. Pickleson, who, up to that remark, had had the dejected appearance of a long Roman rushlight that couldn't anyhow get lighted, brightened up at his top extremity, and made his acknowledgments in a way which, for him, was parliamentary eloquence. He likewise did add that, having ceased to draw as a Roman, Mim had made proposals for his going in as a converted Indian giant worked upon by the dairyman's daughter. This Pickleson, having no acquaintance with the tract named after that young woman, and not being willing to couple gag with his serious views, had declined to do, thereby leading to words and the total stoppage of the unfortunate young man's beer. All of which, during the whole of the interview, was confirmed by the ferocious growling of Mim down below at the pay place, which shook the giant like a leaf. But what was to the present point in the remarks of the travelling giant, otherwise Pickleson, was this.
Dr. Marigold.
I give his words without hope of conveying their feebleness.
Who is the strange young man that hangs about your carts?
A strange young man? I gives him back, thinking that he meant her, and his languid circulation had dropped the syllable.
Doctor,
he returns, with a pathos calculated to draw a tear from even a manly eye.
I am weak, but not so weak yet as I don't know my words. I repeat them, Doctor. A strange young man.
It then appeared that Pickleson, being forced to stretch his legs, not that they wanted it, only at times when he couldn't be seen for nothing, to wit, in the dead of the night and towards daybreak, had twice seen hanging about my carts at that same town of Lancaster, where I had been only 2 nights, this same unknown young man. It put me rather out of sorts. What it meant as to particulars I no more foreboded than you forebode now, but it put me rather out of sorts. Howsoever, I made light of it to Pickleson, and I took leave of Pickleson, advising him to spend his legacy in getting up his stamina, and to continue to stand by his religion. Towards morning, I kept a lookout for this strange young man, and, what was more, I saw the strange young man. He was well dressed and well looking. He loitered very near my carts, watching them like as if he was taking care of them, and soon after daybreak turned and went away. I sent a hail after him, but he never started or looked round or took the smallest notice. We left Lancaster within an hour or 2, on our way towards Carlisle. Next morning at daybreak I looked out again for the strange young man, but I did not see him. But next morning I looked out again, and there he was once more. I sent another hail after him, but as before he gave not the slightest sign of being anyways disturbed. This put a thought into my head. Acting on it, I watched him in different manners and at different times, not necessary to enter into, till I found that this strange young man was deaf and dumb. The discovery turned me over, because I knew that a part of that establishment where she had been allotted to was allotted to some young men, some of them well off, and I thought to myself, if she favours him, where am I? And where is all that I have worked and planned for? Hoping, I must confess to the selfishness, that she might not favour him, I set myself to find out. At last I was by accident present at a meeting between them in the open air, looking on, leaning behind a fir tree, without their knowing of it. It was a move-in meeting for all the 3 parties concerned. I knew every syllable that passed between them as well as they did. I listened with my eyes, which have come to be as quick and true with deaf and dumb conversation as my ears with the talk of people that can speak. He was a-going out to China, as a clerk in a merchant's house, which his father had been before him. He was in circumstances to keep a wife, and he wanted her to marry him and go along with him. She persisted no. He asked if she didn't love him. Yes, she loved him dearly, dearly. But she could never disappoint her beloved, good, noble, generous, and I don't know what all father, meaning me, the cheapjack in the sleeved waistcoat. And she would stay with him, heaven bless him, though it was to break her heart. And she cried most bitterly, and that made up my mind. While my mind had been in an unsettled state about her favouring this young man, I had felt that unreasonable towards Pickleson, that it was well for him I had got his legacy down. For I often thought, if it hadn't been for this same weak-minded giant, I might never have come to trouble my head and vex my soul about the young man. But once that I knew she loved him, once that I had seen her weep for him, it was a different thing. I made it right in my mind with Pickleson on the spot, and I shook myself together to do what was right by all. She had left the young man by that time, for it took a few minutes to get me thoroughly well shook together, and the young man was leaning against another of the fir trees, of which there was a cluster, with his face upon his arm. I touched him on the back. Looking up and seeing me, he says in our deaf and dumb talk, "Do not be angry." "I am not angry, good boy. I am your friend. Come with me." I left him at the foot of the steps of the library cart, and I went up alone. She was drying her eyes. "You have been crying, my dear."
Yes, Father.
"Why?"
A headache.
"Not a heartache?"
I said a headache, Father.
"Dr. Marigold must prescribe for that headache." She took up the book of my prescriptions and held it up with a forced smile. But seeing me keep still and look earnest, she softly laid it down again, and her eyes were very attentive. "The prescription is not there, Sophie."
Where is it?
"Here, my dear." I brought her young husband in, and I put her hand in his, and my only father words to both of them were these: "Dr. Marigold's last prescription, to be taken for life," after which I bolted. When the wedding came off, I mounted a coat, blue and bright buttons, for the first and last time in all my days, and I gave Sophie away with my own hand. There were only 3 of us and the gentleman who had had charge of her for those 2 years. I give the wedding dinner of 4 in the library cart: pigeon pie, a leg of pickled pork, a pair of fowls, and suitable garden stuff, the best of drinks. I give him a speech, and the gentleman give us a speech, and all our jokes told, and the whole went off like a skyrocket. In the course of the entertainment I explained to Sophie that I should keep the library cart as my living cart when not upon the road, and that I should keep all her books for her just as they stood, till she come back to claim them. So she went to China with a young husband, and it was a parting sorrowful and heavy. And I got the boy I had another service, and so of old, when my child and wife were gone, I went plodding on alone, with my whip over my shoulder, at the old horse's head. Sophie wrote me many letters, and I wrote her many letters. About the end of the first year she sent me one in an unsteady hand. "Dearest Father, not a week ago I had a darling little daughter, but I am so well that they let me write these words to you. Dearest and best Father, I hope my child may not be deaf and dumb, but I do not yet know." When I wrote back, I hinted the question, but as Sophie never answered that question, I felt it to be a sad one, and I never repeated it. For a long time our letters were regular, but then they got irregular, through Sophie's husband being moved to another station, and through my being always on the move. But we were in one another's thoughts, I was equally sure, letters or no letters. 5 years, odd months, had gone since Sophie went away. I was still the king of the Cheap Jacks, and at a greater height of popularity than ever. I had had a first-rate autumn of it, and on the 23rd of December, 1864, I found myself at Uxbridge, Middlesex, clean sold out. So I jogged up to London with the old horse, light and easy, to have my Christmas Eve and Christmas Day alone by the fire in the library cart, and then to buy a regular new stock of goods all round, and sell 'em again and get the money. I'm a neat hand at cookery, and I'll tell you what I knocked up for my Christmas Eve dinner in the library cart. I knocked up a beefsteak pudding for one, with 2 kidneys, a dozen oysters, and a couple of mushrooms thrown in. It's a pudding to put a man in good humour with everything, except the 2 bottom buttons of his waistcoat. Having relished that pudding and cleared away, I turned the lamp low, and sat down by the light of the fire, watching it as it shone upon the backs of Sophie's books. Sophie's books so brought up Sophie's self, that I saw her touching face quite plainly before I dropped off, dozing by the fire. This may be a reason why Sophie, with her deaf and dumb child in her arms, seemed to stand silent by me all through my nap. I was on the road, off the road, in all sorts of places, north and south and east and west, winds liked best and winds liked least, here and there and gone astray, over the hills and far away. And still she stood silent by me, with her silent child in her arms. Even when I woke with a start, she seemed to vanish, as if she had stood by me in that very place only a single instant before. I had started at a real sound, and the sound was on the steps of the cart. It was the light, hurried tread of a child, coming clambering up. The tread of a child had once been so familiar to me that for half a moment I believed I was going to see a little ghost. But the touch of a real child was laid upon the outer handle of the door, and the handle turned, and the door opened a little way, and a real child peeped in. A bright little comely girl with large dark eyes. Looking full at me, the tiny creature took off her mite of a straw hat, and a quantity of dark curls fell all about her face. Then she opened her lips and said in a pretty voice, "Grandfather." "Ah, my God," I cries out, "she can speak!"
"Yes, dear grandfather, and I am to ask you whether there was anyone that I reminded you of."
In a moment Sophie was round my neck, as well as the child, and her husband was a-wringing my hand with his face hid, and we all had to shake ourselves together before we could get over it. And when we did begin to get over it, and I saw the pretty child a-talking, pleased and quick and eager and busy to her mother, in the signs that I had first taught her mother, the happy and yet pitying tears fell rolling down my face.